Do not touch me. Those are the first words Jesus pronounces after rising from the dead. Not peace be with you, not I have conquered death, not a cry of victory, a command, cutting. 3 words that stopped the hands of Mary Magdalene in the air, centimeters away from the body of the man she had seen die 3 days before. And 40 verses later, in the same chapter, in the same room, before the same resurrected body, Jesus is going to say exactly the opposite. He is going to extend his hand to Thomas. He is going to tell him, put your finger here, put your hand in my side, touch me as much as you need to touch me. What happened between Mary Magdalene and Thomas that changed things so much? Why does the woman who had followed Jesus from Galilee, the one who had been at the foot of the cross when almost all the men had fled, the first witness of the most important resurrection in human history, receive a "do not touch me"? And a disciple who was hiding, who doubted, who had not even believed the testimony of the others, receive an open invitation to put his fingers in the wounds? That makes no sense unless we understand what Jesus really said that morning. Because the translation you have in your Bible, the one that says, "do not touch me," that translation is hiding something that completely changes what is happening in that garden. The original phrase in Greek is not, "do not touch me." It is something else. It is something much more intimate, much more painful, and much more revealing about who Mary Magdalene was, about what was happening with the body of Jesus at that exact moment, and about why this encounter, this specific encounter between these 2 specific characters in this specific garden, marks the strangest moment of the entire morning of the resurrection. There are 3 things happening at the same time when Jesus pronounces those words. 3 things almost no one explains to you when reading this passage. And when you understand the 3, you are going to understand why some theologians call this verse, John 20:17, one of the most difficult texts of the New Testament. Don Carson, one of the most respected exegetes of the contemporary evangelical world, said it in a way that stayed in the memory of many. This verse belongs to a handful of the most difficult passages in all the New Testament. And now you are going to understand why. But before we see what Jesus really said, you need to see what happened 2 hours earlier. Because Mary Magdalene did not arrive at that garden by chance. She arrived there when it was still dark. And the word John uses to describe that darkness, in Greek, skotia, is not just any word. It is the same word John uses in the first chapter of his Gospel to describe the moment before the light entered the world. The darkness that did not comprehend the light, that darkness. Mary Magdalene walks toward the tomb within that same spiritual darkness, without knowing it. She does not know that she is walking toward the first morning of a new world. For her, it is still Friday. For her, she is still burying someone, and that changes everything in the scene that comes next. Because when she arrives at the tomb and finds the stone rolled away, she does not think he has risen. She thinks they stole him. That is the first layer almost no one explains to you. Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb with spices, with ointments, with the intention of embalming a corpse. That is important because it tells you what her expectation was that morning. Her expectation was to serve a dead man, to honor a dead man, to do for her master what the haste of the Friday burial had not allowed. And when she arrives and sees the stone out of place, the first thing she does is run back. She does not enter. She does not look inside. She runs. She goes to find Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. John does not name himself in his own gospel, but the early tradition clearly identifies him, and she tells them a phrase that is brutal in its honesty. They have taken away the Lord from the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Notice the verb. They have taken away, not he has risen. For her, in that moment, the only possible explanation for an open tomb is a corpse robbery. And that is not a spiritual failure of Mary Magdalene. That is historical realism of the first century. Tomb robberies were so common in the Roman Mediterranean of the 1st century that the Emperor Claudius, according to an inscription discovered in Nazareth and published for the first time in 1930, promulgated an edict that punished with the death penalty anyone who profaned tombs. The inscription is known as the Diatagma Caesaros. It is in the Louvre Museum. It exists. You can look it up. That means that when Mary Magdalene sees that open tomb, she's not being cynical to think of a robbery. She's being logical. She's being of her time. And that perfectly human logic is what leads her to do something that changes everything that comes after. Peter and John run. They arrive at the tomb. They enter. They see the linen cloths folded. They see the burial cloth apart in its place. And here, John, the evangelist, writes one of the most subtle phrases of the New Testament. He says that John saw and believed, but immediately afterward he says, "For they did not yet understand the scripture, that he had to rise from the dead." That phrase is an apparent contradiction. He saw and believed, but did not understand. How does one believe something one does not understand? There are those who interpret this as a partial believing, an intuition without doctrine, a faith without framework, something like, "I believe that something extraordinary happened here, but I have no idea what." And then Peter and John leave. They leave. That is the word. They return to their home, says the text. And there, at that moment, Mary Magdalene is left alone outside the tomb, weeping. Stay with that image, because that image is the key to everything that comes after. A woman alone outside an open tomb, weeping. The two men closest to the Master have just left. They have left her there. It is a small detail, almost invisible in the text, but one that carries an enormous weight. Peter and John leave. Mary stays, and the Western tradition has read this detail in 1,000 ways. But there is a reading almost no one makes, and it is this: Mary Magdalene stays because she has nowhere else to go. Her Master is dead. The little she had left, the body, the possibility of honoring him, the hope of a worthy mourning, has just disappeared. She has no master, she has no body, she has no tomb. The only thing she has left is that empty place, and she stays there because to leave from there would be to surrender. That woman weeping in front of an empty tomb is one of the most powerful images of Christianity, and it is the exact image to which Jesus is going to appear first, before Peter, before his mother, before John, before the gathered apostles, before the two on the way to Emmaus, before anyone. Jesus rises, and the first person he appears to is a woman weeping because they stole a corpse. That choice is not accidental. That choice is theological. And here something strange happens. Mary leans toward the tomb. She looks inside, and she sees two angels dressed in white. One where the head of the body of Jesus had been, and another where the feet had been. That placement, two white figures at the extremes of the place where the body had been, immediately evokes for the 1st century Jewish reader the Ark of the Covenant. Above the Ark there were two cherubim, one at each end, and between them the presence of God was manifested, the mercy seat, the place where the blood of the sacrifice was sprinkled on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur. John is painting something deeper than it seems. He is telling you in silence without explaining it that this empty tomb is now the true mercy seat, the place where two figures dressed in white frame the space where the body of the Lamb was. And the body is not there, because the sacrifice was accepted, because the atonement was complete. Mary Magdalene knows nothing of this. She sees two men in white, and they ask her why she is weeping. And she answers with the same phrase, the same, repeated, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." 3 times in this chapter, Mary is going to say some version of that phrase. 3 times she is going to talk about the stolen body. Her mind is blocked on a single possibility, and that is important because it shows you how profoundly human her pain was. How completely logical. How impossible it was for her to think of another option. And then, while she is talking with the angels, something moves behind her. She turns around, and she sees someone standing there, and according to the text, she does not recognize him. She thinks he is the gardener, the man in charge of caring for the orchard where the tomb was. This has to stop you in your tracks, because Mary Magdalene knew Jesus. She had followed him for years. She had heard him preach. She had seen him heal the sick. She had accompanied him to the foot of the cross. She had seen him die. And now, 3 days later, she does not recognize him. Why? There are 3 possible answers to this question, and each opens a different layer of the text. The first answer is the simplest. It was dark. It was still early. Her eyes were swollen from weeping. But that explanation is not enough, because the text is going to say that she recognizes his voice immediately when he says a single word. The darkness and the tears do not impede auditory recognition, only visual. So something else was happening. The second answer is theological, and it is the one that many fathers of the early church held, from Chrysostom to Augustine. It is the idea that the resurrected body of Jesus was different. It was not a ghost. But it was not exactly the same body as before either. It was the same body glorified. And that difference, subtle but real, made recognition require something more than sight. It required revelation. The same is going to happen on the way to Emmaus. That same afternoon, 2 disciples are going to walk kilometers with Jesus, talking with him, listening to him explain the scriptures, and they are not going to recognize him until he breaks the bread. And then, says the text, their eyes were opened. The third answer is the most uncomfortable, and it is this. Perhaps Mary does not recognize him because she is not expecting to recognize him, because when the pain of a loss is so great, when the mind has accepted death so completely, when the heart has closed itself to the possibility, the very presence of the one who is given up for lost becomes invisible. There are people in front of us, in very real and very modern scenarios, whom we cannot see because our mind gave them up for lost. A mother who no longer expects the prodigal son to return, and one day they cross paths in the street and she walks by without seeing him, because her heart has already done the mourning, and mourning is a form of blindness. Something of that is happening with Mary in that garden, and Jesus knows it. That is why what comes next is not a spectacular miracle. It is not a transfiguration. It is not a cry from the clouds. It is a word, a single word, but the exact word. Jesus says one word, Mary. That is all, a single word, her name. But the way he says it, and the ancient readers of the Gospel of John would have understood this immediately, is loaded with deep resonance. Because 10 chapters earlier, in this same Gospel, Jesus had said a phrase that now explodes in meaning. He had said, "The good shepherd calls his sheep by name, and they recognize his voice." And he had said more, "The sheep will not follow a stranger, but will flee from him, because they do not know the voice of the stranger." Mary was fleeing. She was about to leave. She was seeing a gardener, until the shepherd called her by name. And then, according to the text, she turns. And she says a single word in Aramaic, Rabboni, which the evangelist immediately translates for his Greek readers. It means master, but literally, it means my great master. It is an affective superlative. It is not a technical word. It is a word of belonging. It is like saying my everything. It is the word of someone who recognizes not only an identity, but a relationship. And here, exactly here, in this moment of recognition, now comes the phrase that we are going to disassemble piece by piece. Because Mary does something. The text does not describe it explicitly, but the response of Jesus reveals it. She launches herself toward him. She grabs him. She embraces him. She holds him. And Jesus says those three words that your Bible probably translates as "do not touch me." But that is not what the Greek says. The Greek says "me mo hapto." Three words. The first, me, is a negation. The second, mu, is the pronoun of me or to me. The third, hapto, is the word that changes everything. Hapto comes from the verb hapto. And hapto does not only mean to touch in the superficial sense of brushing with a finger. Hapto means to grab, to hold, to grip, to cling to something, not to let go. It is the verb used to describe how one takes hold of an object that one does not want to drop. It is the verb used for fire that catches and does not release. It is grip, not touch. And there is something more. The verb is in the present imperative. And that in Greek does not mean do not do this action right now. It means stop doing the action you are already doing. It is an imperative of cessation, like when someone shouts stop to a person who is already running. It is not a prohibition of starting. It is an order to stop something already in progress. That means that when you put the three words together, the most faithful translation to the Greek is not "do not touch me." It is "stop clinging to me," or "let go of me," or "do not cling to me like this." That is an abysmal difference because it completely changes the image. The traditional translation suggests a distant Jesus, almost wary, who keeps Mary at a distance with an authoritative gesture. The Greek translation suggests something completely different. It suggests a woman embracing the resurrected body of Jesus, weeping, not wanting to let go, clinging with all her strength to the only certainty she has left in the universe, and a Jesus who does not reject her, who does not push her away, who lets her embrace him, but who needs her to understand something, that she cannot stay like this, that this is not the way the relationship with him is going to work from now on. And that brings you to the central question, the one so many theologians call one of the most difficult passages of the New Testament. Why? Why does Jesus need Mary to let go? And why is the reason he gives that strange phrase that comes next, "Because I have not yet ascended to the Father"? Within that response of Jesus, there is a tiny adverb that almost no one underlines. And that small adverb, when you stop on it, opens three different doors in the text. The word is yet. In Greek, upo. I have not yet ascended to the Father. And that word, yet, is the center of gravity of the entire verse, because it suggests something in process, something that is happening now but has not yet ended. It suggests that the body of Jesus, in that very instant, in that garden, in that exact moment when Mary is embracing him, is in a transition. It is in an intermediate state, not completely among the dead, evidently, because he is alive and walking, but not completely glorified in the presence of the Father either. He is in the middle, and Mary is grabbing him right in the middle. That is the first door the word yet opens. Some ancient theologians, and here enters a layer almost no one explains to you, interpreted this in a liturgical key. They remembered that in the Old Testament, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest had to enter the Holy of Holies with the blood of the sacrifice to sprinkle it on the mercy seat. And while the high priest was performing that act, there was a ritual restriction. No one could touch him. No one could interrupt him. No one could contaminate his ritual purity until the act was complete. The idea is this: perhaps Jesus, as the true high priest according to the letter to the Hebrews, chapters 7 through 10, was between the cross and the heavenly sanctuary. He had completed the sacrifice, but he had not yet entered the Holy of Holies of the heavens to present his own blood as the definitive offering. And for that reason, in that exact moment, he could not be detained by a human embrace. That is a beautiful reading, but there is a technical difficulty. If that reading were literal, then the problem would be physical contact itself. and it was not, because Matthew 28 verse 9 records the women, including Mary Magdalene in most of the harmonizations, embracing the feet of the resurrected Jesus and worshipping him. And Jesus does not pull away, he lets them. And hours later, in the upper room, he is going to tell Thomas to put his fingers in his wounds. If the problem were contact, all those moments would be impossible. So the problem was not touching. The problem was clinging. The problem was the verb hapto in the present continuous. The problem was not Mary's hand on the side of Jesus. The problem was that Mary's hand did not want to let go ever. And that opens the second door. Mary, according to the most careful reading of the Greek text, did not want to let go of Jesus because she had just recovered him. She had just spent 3 days thinking that she had lost him forever. And in her heart, in her perfectly human logic, the solution was simple. If Jesus is alive, then everything goes back to being like before. The Master returns to Galilee. The disciples follow him. The crowds come to listen to him. The life she had had during the last few years returns. Death was a horrible mistake that has now passed. And now, everything continues as before. And Jesus does not let her hold that idea for a single second more, because the idea is false. And if Mary stays with that idea, she is going to misunderstand absolutely everything that comes after. The resurrection is not a return to the previous life. The resurrection is the entry into a new life, a life in which Jesus is not going to be walking the roads of Galilee, a life in which Jesus is going to ascend to the Father, a life in which his presence is no longer going to be geographical, but universal. He is no longer going to be a body that you embrace in a garden. He is going to be a presence that accompanies you in all the gardens, in all the houses, in all the deserts of the world, simultaneously. And for that new form of presence to exist, this old form of presence has to end. That is why Jesus says, "Let me go." That is why he says, "Do not cling to me like this," because Mary wants to freeze the moment, and the moment cannot be frozen. The moment is only the beginning of something greater, and here comes the twist almost no one sees. Because if you read carefully what Jesus asks of Mary immediately after telling her, "Do not cling to me," you find something disconcerting. He gives her a mission. He tells her, "Go to my brothers and tell them that I ascend to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." That phrase is constructed with an almost surgical theological precision. My Father and your Father, my God and your God. Jesus does not say our Father. He does not say our God. He says my and your. And the fathers of the early church, from Athanasius in the 4th century, saw in that distinction something crucial. Jesus is the Son of God by nature. We are children of God by adoption. His sonship and our sonship are not identical. But, and here is the point, for the first time in the entire gospel, Jesus calls his disciples my brothers for the first time. Before he had called them disciples, friends, servants, but never brothers. Never. What changed? The resurrection changed everything, because now, by virtue of the victory over death, the disciples enter into a new relationship with the Father that before only the Son had. They share, in a derivative but real way, the same sonship. And the first message of that new reality is carried by a woman. That, in the 1st century, was scandalous. Stay with that for a moment. Because in the Judea of the 1st century, the testimony of a woman was not considered valid in many legal courts. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, in his Jewish Antiquities, Book 4, Chapter 8, Paragraph 15, explicitly records that the testimony of women should not be accepted because of the lightness and boldness of their sex. Those are his words, his textual words as a Jewish historian of the 1st century. And yet, the Gospel of John chooses deliberately consciously against the entire culture, to make the first witness of the resurrection a woman, and not just any woman, Mary Magdalene. Some modern scholars, like N.T. Wright in his book The Resurrection of the Son of God, have argued that this detail is one of the strongest historical arguments in favor of the veracity of the account. If the evangelists had invented the story of the resurrection, they would have told it in a way that was credible in their cultural context. They would have placed Peter as the first witness, or John, or a group of respectable men. They would not have placed a woman whose testimony was legally questionable. The fact that the account begins with Mary Magdalene in the four Gospels with variations suggests that the authors were telling what actually happened, not what was strategically convenient. And that brings you to a question that is rarely asked. Why her? Why Mary of Magdala? Why the woman of whom Luke 8 verse 2 says that Jesus had cast out 7 demons? Why that woman in particular? The traditional answer is the most obvious: because she was there. Because she had followed Jesus from Galilee, because she had been at the foot of the cross, because she had been faithful when the others fled. Faithfulness receives the first revelation. That is a true answer. But there is another layer. The other layer is this: Mary Magdalene represents the most improbable person, a woman in a patriarchal culture, someone with a documented past of demonic possession, someone whose testimony was legally dismissed. And precisely because of that, precisely because of her improbability, she becomes the perfect icon of how the kingdom that Jesus inaugurates works. The kingdom where the last will be first, where the rejected will be the ones sent, where those who could not testify will be the first witnesses of the most important event in the history of the world. That is not a pretty detail. That is the core of the gospel operating in a single scene. And if that idea is moving something inside you, if the idea that the first witness of the resurrection was precisely the person the world dismissed touches something in you, let me ask you something simple before continuing. Give this video a like. It is not a favor for me. It is a way for YouTube to show this content to another person who perhaps right now feels exactly the way Mary Magdalene felt that morning, weeping without a master, without knowing where what she lost went. Perhaps that someone needs to see what comes next, and a like, just one click, makes the algorithm show it. Now, let us return to the garden, because there is something more in that scene that almost no one explains to you. When Mary obeys, when she stops clinging, when she goes to find the disciples to tell them what she saw, she runs back to Jerusalem with a phrase on her lips. The phrase with which the gospel records her announcement is, "I have seen the Lord." She does not say, "I have touched the Lord." She says, "I have seen the Lord." That verb is important because the physical contact, the embrace, the grip, that has already happened. That was the private moment. But the public testimony, the message that she's going to take to the rest of the world, is built on sight, on seeing, on the gaze that recognized. And that connects with something that is going to happen a few hours later in the upper room. Because when the disciples gather that night, doors closed, fear of the Jewish authorities, according to John 20 verse 19, Jesus appears in the middle of them. Not through the door he appears. He passes through whatever is between the place where they are and the place where he is, and he shows them the hands and the side. Only Thomas was not there. And when he returns, the others tell him, "We have seen the Lord," the same phrase as Mary. And Thomas says that brutal phrase that stayed in Western language for 2,000 years. "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and put my finger in the place of the nails, and put my hand in his side, I will not believe." 8 days later, Jesus appears again, and he says exactly the opposite of what he had said to Mary. He says, "Bring your finger here, look at my hands, bring your hand and put it in my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing. Touch me." And here comes the question that opens everything. Why does he say to Mary, who already believed, "Do not cling"? And why does he say to Thomas, who did not believe, "Touch me as much as you need"? The answer is not in a contradiction. The answer is in the direction of each one's faith. Mary had already recognized Jesus. She had already shouted, "Rabboni." She already had the certainty, and precisely for that reason, her problem was not believing. Her problem was passing from one form of believing to another, from a faith that needed the physical presence of the body to a faith that was going to live from the spiritual presence of the resurrected one. That is why Jesus asks her to let go, because the faith that is going to sustain her the rest of her life cannot depend on an embrace. She has to learn to believe without grabbing. She has to learn to release the body to find the resurrected one. Thomas had the opposite problem. Thomas had heard the testimony. He knew the news, but he did not believe. And because of that, he needed something more. He needed contact. He needed to feel the wounds beneath his fingers. He needed the physical weight of the glorified body, not because faith comes through the senses. Jesus will tell him immediately afterward, "Blessed are those who have not seen and have believed," but because Jesus in his mercy leaned down to where Thomas was, and he offered him the proof he needed to begin. That is what makes the difference. Mary did not need proof. She needed to learn to let go. Thomas needed proof. He needed to learn to believe. And Jesus gave each one exactly what they needed, even though it was the opposite. But there is something more profound in this exchange between Jesus and Mary. Something that requires you to understand who she was exactly, because the Mary Magdalene of the popular Western imagination is not the Mary Magdalene of the New Testament. The culture has mixed three distinct women into a single composite figure, a tradition that was made official in Sermon 33 of Pope Gregory the Great, in the year 591 of the Christian era, where for the first time Mary Magdalene is identified with the sinful woman who anoints the feet of Jesus in Luke 7, and with Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus and Martha. Three distinct biblical women, fused into one by medieval Western imagination. The Vatican officially corrected that fusion in 1969 during the reform of the Roman liturgical calendar, but the popular image was never fully corrected. That is why even today, when someone says Mary Magdalene, many people think of a repentant prostitute, and that is not in the biblical text anywhere. That characterization is a later overlay. What the biblical text does say, in Luke 8 verses 1 through 3, is something different and less novelistic. It says that Mary, called Magdalene, that is originally from Magdala, a fishing city on the western coast of the Sea of Galilee, was one of several women who had been healed by Jesus from evil spirits and illnesses, and that these women now traveled with him and the 12, sustaining them economically with their own goods. Luke says explicitly that 7 demons had come out of her. 7 demons. That is a dense declaration. In biblical symbolism, 7 represents fullness. 7 demons does not necessarily mean 7 specific entities, but a complete spiritual possession, total, devastating. Mary Magdalene before Jesus was someone completely taken over, completely inhabited, completely defeated, and Jesus had freed her completely. When you understand this, the scene of the garden explodes in meaning, because the woman who is embracing the body of the Master, not wanting to let him go, is the woman who 3 days before had seen die, the only one who had ever freed her from something she had not been able to free herself from. Imagine it. You were trapped, you were lost, and this man gave you back your life. He gave you back your name. He gave you back your humanity. And suddenly, that man is nailed to a Roman cross, and then he is buried in a borrowed tomb, and then the tomb is empty, and then, impossible, incredible, he is there, alive, in front of you, saying your name, how not to cling, how to let go. That is why, when Jesus tells her, "Do not cling to me," it is not a rejection. It is an invitation to a more mature faith, to the faith that Mary is going to need the next day, and the day after, and the years after, when there is no longer a body to embrace, when the presence has to be different, when the physical master has ascended to the Father, and the only way to have him keeps being to believe. And here, in this verse, in this interrupted embrace, in this "let me go," the entire Christian spirituality is being born, the spirituality that is going to sustain millions of people for 2,000 years. People who are never going to touch Jesus. People who are never going to see him with physical eyes. People who are going to believe based on the testimony of Mary. And the testimony of Mary, paradoxically, is not built on the embrace she obtained. It is built on the embrace she learned to release. And that idea, learning to let go of what can no longer be had in the way it was had before, is something you probably already know without knowing that you know it. Because there is a modern version of the garden scene that happens every day in hospitals around the world. It happens like this. A woman is beside her mother's bed. The mother has been in the hospital for weeks. There is a terminal cancer. The doctors can no longer do more. The woman enters the room every morning expecting the worst. And one morning, when she enters, the bed is empty. The curtain is drawn. The sheets are folded with that clinical precision with which hospitals fold the sheets when someone is no longer going to need them. And she stays there, at the door, without understanding, without being able to weep, without being able to think, like Mary Magdalene at the edge of the open tomb. And then weeks later, in the most vivid dream she has had in her life, she sees her mother. She sees her clearly. She sees her speaking. She sees her smiling. She sees her saying her name. And in the dream, she throws herself to embrace her. She wants to stay in that dream forever. She wants the dream to never end. And the mother, in the dream, tells her something she did not expect. She tells her, "You have to wake up. You have to live. You cannot stay here with me." That is a fictional scene. It is not a doctrine. It is not a promise of real revelations. It is just an image. But it shows you what the text of the garden is teaching. There are forms of presence we have to release to find greater forms of presence. And the inability to let go can be, in itself, a form of clinging to a version that no longer exists of someone who does exist, but in another way. That is what Mary had to learn, and that is what Jesus, with surgical tenderness, was teaching her to learn. But there is something more, something that closes a deeper layer of the text, and it is that when Jesus tells Mary, "Go to my brothers," he is making Mary an apostle. Apostle means the one who is sent. Apostle with a mission, apostle with a message. And Mary Magdalene, by virtue of that order, becomes what the early Christian tradition called her, Apostola Apostolorum, apostle of the apostles, the one who carries the first message to the first messengers. That phrase is not a modern invention. We find it in Christian writings of the 2nd century. Hippolytus of Rome, in his commentary on the Song of Songs, around the year 230 of the Christian era, calls Mary Magdalene explicitly apostle. And Thomas Aquinas, 1,000 years later, in his commentary on the Gospel of John, takes up exactly that expression. Apostolorum apostola, the apostle of the apostles. There is something very dense in that, because it means that in strictly chronological terms, Mary Magdalene preceded Peter. She preceded John. She preceded Paul. She preceded everyone. The Christian mission, as a movement of announcement of the resurrected one, does not begin at Pentecost with the tongue of fire over the male apostles. It begins in silence in a garden on a Sunday morning. When a woman runs to Jerusalem with the phrase, "I have seen the Lord" on her lips, and all that mission, all that apostolicity, all that chronological primacy depends on a single gesture. It depends on Mary having obeyed the order to let go. If she had stayed embracing the body of Jesus indefinitely, without moving, without taking the message, there would be no apostola apostolorum. There would be no first testimony. There would be no first announcement. The nascent church begins with a very specific act of obedience, to let go. Now then, there is a question that perhaps you, seeing it all from outside, are already asking yourself. If letting go of Jesus physically was the point, why then, exactly 40 days later, is there going to be another ascension? Luke, in the first chapter of Acts, records that during 40 days Jesus appears to the disciples, speaks to them about the kingdom of God, eats with them. There is a specific scene of Jesus eating roasted fish recorded by Luke in his Gospel, and only afterward is he raised to heaven in the presence of the apostles, until a cloud receives him and hides him. If Jesus had already ascended to the Father on the Sunday of the resurrection, according to the most obvious reading of John 20, verse 17, why 40 days later does there have to be another ascension? Here, the exegetes are divided. Some, following a reading sustained by the British commentator Charles Kingsley Barrett in his commentary on the Gospel of John, suggest that Jesus indeed ascended in an initial way to the Father between the moment of the garden and the moment of the upper room that same night. A kind of inaugural presentation in the heavenly sanctuary, almost immediate, not public, almost priestly. And then he returned, and during 40 days he was appearing in this world in a glorified but present body until the moment of the definitive public ascension with witnesses arrived. Other scholars reject that reading. They argue that the phrase, "I have not yet ascended to the Father," does not need to be interpreted in such a chronological way, that the "yet" refers to the general state of the complete paschal process, which culminates 40 days later on the Mount of Olives. That Mary was trying to cling to a pre-Pentecost Jesus, and that Jesus was pointing toward a future Pentecost where the presence of the Spirit would replace the physical presence. The two readings have their serious defenders. There is no academic consensus, but the two coincide in something central. The body that Mary Magdalene embraced that morning in the garden was not simply a recovered body. It was a body in transition toward a new form of existence. And that body in transition could not be detained by a human embrace. It had to fulfill its trajectory. That opens something to the modern reader, something the Christian tradition has held for centuries, but that in popular Christianity is diluted. And it is that the resurrection of Jesus is not a reanimation. It is not Lazarus coming out of the tomb to die years later. It is not a resurrected one who is going to live 100 more years in Galilee. It is not a master who stays. The resurrection of Jesus is the first fruits of a new body, a body that is going to be, according to the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, the first example of what the body of the redeemed will be. A glorified body, a body that belongs to another order. That body cannot be the property of anyone, not even of Mary Magdalene. That body is the beginning of the spring of the world. And spring does not stay in the garden. Spring leaves the garden. And here, exactly here, you find the last door that the word "yet" opens. Because when Jesus says, "I have not yet ascended to the Father," he is not speaking only of chronology. He is speaking of incompleteness. He is saying that the work is not yet complete, and the word that John chose to write this entire gospel ends with a similar word on the cross, chapter 19, verse 30, tetelestai. It is finished. But that finished of Friday is not the same as the completed of Sunday. The sacrifice, yes, is finished, but the total delivery to the Father, the presentation, the enthronement of the Son at the right hand of the Father, that is in process. And that process is precisely what Mary is interrupting with her embrace. That is why "let me go" is not rejection. It is theology in motion. And if you stay with that idea, theology in motion, you're going to see the verse in a new way. Because Mary Magdalene in that garden is not the woman who is rejected. She is the woman who is sent. She is not the woman to whom is said, "Do not come close." She is the woman to whom is said, "You are going to be the first to carry the news that will change the world." The letting go is the condition. The going is the mission. There is one more question worth asking before closing this episode. How many times have you, in your own spiritual life, wanted to cling to a form of faith that has already fulfilled its purpose? How many times have you tried to stay in a moment of God, an experience, a church, a stage, an emotion, because you felt that if you let go, you lost everything? The garden scene tells you that letting go is not losing. Letting go is the condition for entering the next form of presence. Mary Magdalene released the body, and then, seconds later, she was the first person in human history to proclaim the resurrection. If she had maintained the embrace, she would have had the body, but she would not have had the mission. She would not have had the title. She would not have had the place in history that she now occupies 2,000 years later in every cathedral of the world, where her image appears next to the empty tomb. Clinging, paradoxically, was the only way to lose. Letting go was the only way to gain more. And what is valid for her is valid for many people today. There are people who are clinging to a memory, to a church that no longer exists as it existed, to a stage of faith that was real but has already fulfilled its time, to a spiritual leader who departed, to a sensation of closeness with God they lived once and never returned. And they stay there, embracing something that the Lord Himself is asking them to release so that they can enter into the next form of the relationship. That letting go is not betrayal of what they lived. It is fidelity to what comes. Mary Magdalene, in practical terms, never stopped loving Jesus after that interrupted embrace. It is not that letting go meant distance. It meant maturity. The Mary Magdalene who came running back to Jerusalem, shouting, "I have seen the Lord," loved Jesus more than the Mary Magdalene who was embracing His body in the garden, because now she loved the living Christ, not the embalmed corpse. She loved the resurrected one, not the memory. She loved the one who ascends to the Father, not the one who stays on earth. And that is why, when the Eastern Christian icons, especially in the Byzantine tradition, paint Mary Magdalene, they almost always paint her with a red egg in her hand. That image comes from a tradition that connects her with the Emperor Tiberius, where Mary, according to the legend, would have presented a white egg to the Caesar as a symbol of the resurrection, and the egg would have turned red in her hands. It is a legend. It is not documented history, but the image stayed. And that is why, if you enter an Orthodox church on any Easter Sunday, you are going to see icons of Mary Magdalene with a red egg in her hand. The egg is the perfect symbol, something that appears to be dead, sealed, closed, and that in reality contains a new life waiting to come out. That is how the tomb was. That is how the body of Jesus was, and that, in a certain way, is how Mary Magdalene was. But there is one more thing in this text, a small thing, almost imperceptible, that changes the entire reading, and it is this. When you read John 20 verse 16, just before the phrase, "Do not cling to me," the evangelist uses a very specific Greek participle to describe how Mary reacts when Jesus calls her by name. The term is straphaisa. It means having turned, having spun around, having changed direction with her body. But here is the detail. Mary had already turned before. 2 verses earlier, in 14, it is already described that she had turned and saw Jesus standing without recognizing him. So how does she turn twice? How does she turn her body twice toward the same person? Some commentators, like Raymond Brown, one of the most respected Catholic exegetes of the 20th century, in his monumental commentary on the Gospel of John, published by the Anchor Bible, suggests that the second "having turned" is not a physical turn. It is an interior turn. It is conversion. It is the technical word that the New Testament uses to describe the moment when someone turns to God. Epistrepho, to convert, in its root shares meaning with that verbal family. When Jesus pronounces the name Mary, she physically perhaps does not move much, but something in her turns, something in her interior turns, and from that interior turn she says, Rabboni. That means that the true miracle of the scene is not the apparition, it is the conversion. It is not Jesus making himself visible, it is Mary turning toward him in a way that goes beyond the eyes. And that interior turn is the model, according to the patristic tradition, of every Christian conversion, because every conversion is exactly that. Looking toward one side without recognizing the resurrected one who is right behind you, until your name is pronounced, and then you turn, and then you see him, and then you shout his title, and then you want to cling, and then he tells you, "Let me go, because now you have to go." That is what happened that morning in the garden. And here, finally, the revelation that reorganizes everything we have seen up to now. Because the Gospel of John begins with an image, the image of the first chapter. The Word that was with God from the beginning, the light that comes into the world, the light that the darkness did not comprehend. That image opens the Gospel. And the image of the garden in chapter 20 closes it. But the two images are connected by something almost no one notices. The first Adam, according to the book of Genesis, was placed in a garden. The first encounter between humanity and God was in a garden. The first fall happened in a garden. And there in that original garden, there was a woman who heard a voice, turned toward it, and everything broke. Eve. And here, in the garden of the tomb, there is another scene. Another woman who hears a voice. Another woman who turns. But this time the voice is not the voice of the serpent saying, "You will be like God." This time the voice is the voice of the Messiah saying the exact name, Mary. And this time the turning does not break anything. This time the turning inaugurates everything. This time the turning begins the new world. That is why Mary, in the text, mistakes Jesus for the gardener, the keeper of the orchard. And that detail, which seems an error of Mary's, is in reality pure theology, because Jesus, according to the ancient Christian reading, is indeed the gardener, the new Adam, the one who comes to a garden to undo what was broken in the other garden, the one who comes to call a woman by her name, and to make that name be, this time, the beginning of healing, and not the beginning of the fall. Mary Magdalene in this text is not only Mary, she is the new Eve, and Jesus in this text is not only the recovered Master, he is the new Adam resurrected. And that, for everyone who reads the Gospel carefully, changes everything, because the phrase "do not touch me" stops being a rejection of a master to a too affectionate woman and becomes a cosmic declaration. The new Adam, in the new garden, says to the new Eve, the moment of the embrace in the orchard is no longer the center of the story. Now the story is to ascend to the Father. Now the story is the mission. Now the story is to take the message to the brothers. The era of the closed garden ended. The era of the garden open to the world begins, and that is why Mary lets go, and that is why she runs, and that is why she shouts, "I have seen the Lord," and that is why, 2,000 years later, in this exact moment, someone is hearing this message and understanding, perhaps for the first time, that the coldest phrase of the morning of the resurrection was, in reality, the warmest phrase. The phrase of a master who is asking his disciple to dare to believe without grabbing, to dare to let go to find more, to dare to leave the garden, to take the garden to the world. Mary Magdalene obeyed, and that is why her name remained in the first gospel that was preached, and that is why her voice was the first voice that said, in human history, the 4 words that changed everything. I have seen the Lord. 4 words. And a woman running back to Jerusalem with the morning being born behind her, and the darkness, the Scotia of the first chapter of John, retreating, and the day opening, and the message that 2,000 years later is still sounding. That keeps sounding right now, that perhaps is sounding inside you in this exact moment while you are listening, without you knowing that it is also for you, because you are also in a garden. You are also weeping in front of something you gave up for lost. You are also waiting for someone to come to take away what is left of what you lost, without knowing that behind you is standing the Master himself, waiting only for you to hear your name. And when you hear it, the same thing that happened to Mary is going to happen. You are going to turn. You are going to shout. You are going to want to cling. And he is going to tell you the same thing. Do not cling like that. Let go, I am with you. But not in the way you are imagining, in a greater way. A way that does not fit in an embrace. A way that fits in your entire life. And then he is going to give you a mission, as he gave her. And the mission is going to be, as then, to go. To take the news. To tell someone what you have seen. To break the silence. To convert yourself, you yourself, into the next link of a chain that comes from a morning in a garden 2,000 years ago, where a woman learned that letting go of the body of the resurrected one was the only way to have him forever. Subscribe to the channel before you leave. Not for us, because what you have just heard connects directly with another topic that is already waiting for you on screen. There is a video on this channel that answers a question that probably remained with you after listening to this one. The question is this: what happened exactly between the moment Mary Magdalene let go of the Lord and the moment that same night when he entered passing through the closed doors of the upper room? Where was Jesus during those hours? To whom else did he appear? What did he do in that interval between the garden and the closed room?